Hello, and welcome back to my podcast, Cross Currents. My name is Rashid, and I'm coming to you from Houston, Texas. This week, I want to start with how useless the Democratic leadership in both the Senate and the House have been in rebutting Republican claims that, that big, ugly Trump plan that they pushed through a few weeks ago um, is going to hurt millions and billions of Americans. Because in that big, ugly Trump plan, the Republicans voted to cut drastically funding for Medicare, and they also did not vote to renew the Obamacare ACA health insurance plans tax credits. They did not vote to renew those, and those are due to expire on December 31st of this year, with potentially 20 million Americans having to pay double or more than double of what they're currently paying now. So, for example, I have health insurance through Obamacare, and I'm paying $480 a month. So without these tax rebates that the U.S. federal government gives to these insurance companies, I will be looking at potentially having to pay, double what I'm paying today. It's like, more than $900 a month, which is frankly just too much. You should watch the videos of Jennifer Welch and Angie Pumps Sullivan on YouTube. Their channel is called iHip News, IHIP News. They're two women who are very critical of Donald Trump and his administration and all of his administration's shenanigans. And in an episode that aired yesterday, Thursday, October the 2nd, they were talking about how Senator Chuck Schumer, who is the leader of the Democrats in the Senate, and Representative Hakeem Jeffries, who is the leader of the Democrats in the House, are basically useless at defending, the Democrat position of wanting to get funding restored to Medicare and the Obama health care insurance plans. They're just so useless. And both of them said that Bernie Sanders should become the Democratic leader for the Senate, and in the House it should be Representative Alexandria Ocasio, who the Republicans love to hate. So, just before the shutdown on Monday, all these Republican leaders were saying, well, the Democrats should approve this, emergency funding of the federal government, and we'll talk about renewing the tax credits for the Obamacare health plans and restoring some funding to Medicare like in 7 or 9 weeks from now. So the Republicans were being extremely disingenuous, trying to push a potential, agreement between the Republicans and the Democrats right to the congressional session in December, which is really, really terrible. And they're just playing with, the health and the health care of millions and millions of Americans. Because as I said, 20 million Americans have health insurance through the Obamacare plans, and many millions depend on Medicare throughout the U.S. to get medical care that they couldn't afford otherwise. So it's really, really, really an awful situation. And speaking of awful situations, this past weekend I went to visit an older relative of mine, who of course is American. He's been a lifelong Republican. He's originally from Missouri, but he lives here in Texas. And of course, he loves Trump, and he loves all the Trumpistas and everything they've been doing. And in the course of our conversation, he repeated something he had been saying to me before. He said, Trump is the greatest president of my lifetime. So I thought for a few seconds, and then I said, well, Trump is the worst president of my lifetime. And then we ensued to have a friendly argument about why I thought Trump was terrible and why he thought Trump was great. The main thing I said is I attacked Trump on these ridiculous tariffs that he's imposing on all of these countries around the world. And I said, how are these new tariffs helping the average American citizen? I said, all the money's going to the federal government, and they haven't announced a way of sending out, welfare checks to all U.S. citizens to help them with all these rising prices and inflation. because Trump famously kept insisting that American companies would eat the tariffs, meaning that they would swallow the tariffs and pay for them, but not pass on the cost to us, the final consumer who buys things in stores. And that was true in the very beginning, but now companies can no longer do that. It's not economically feasible. So they're passing on the cost of these tariffs to us, the consumers. So it's really hitting Americans in their pocketbooks. And during my little argument with my relative, the wife of my relative jumped up and said, do you guys need blood pressure medication? And she sort of ran out of the room, but then she came back, and in the end, we were smiling again, both of us, me and my relative. But it felt really good to have the argument and to stand up for the things that I believe in and to really criticize Trump for all the horrible things he's been doing to America. Defunding the Voice of America was just, why defund it? It was started in 1943 by an act of Congress as a form of spreading American views and propaganda around the world to counter the German Nazis. And millions of people were listening to Voice of America broadcasts around the world, because the Voice of America not only broadcasted in English, it broadcasted in many Asian languages. So its reach was really far and far between. Republicans, the Trump Republicans got it into their heads that it was a huge waste of money, and they've just slashed it to bits. And there's barely anybody left at the Voice of America, which is really a shame. And, all these cutbacks that Trump has been doing against environmental regulations, that he's making the Environmental Protection Agency go back on so many, laws and regulations that have been put into practice over the last several decades, is really worrying for me, and it should be worrying to everybody else in America. But yes, I can't wait for the midterm elections next year. Trump knows that Republicans are going to lose badly across America. That's why he's been trying to force Republican majority states to redistrict their voting precincts so as to give Republicans a majority in the state. He managed to do that here in Texas, where I live, because government, basically an idiot, and agreed with Trump to do this. He's tried to do this in other Republican-led states, and they have been acquiescent. So it was left up to the Democratic governor of California, Gavin Newsom, to threaten the Trump administration that he would do the same thing in California and, redraw the voting district lines to give Democrats a big advantage in the state of California. And I sort of believe in this. You have to fight fire with fire. You can't just be meek and like Senator Chuck Schumer saying, oh, maybe we'll reach an agreement with the Republicans. It's like, no, they don't want an agreement now. They just want their big ugly bill to continue as it is, with all their cuts that they put into it for Medicare and for Obamacare. And Hakeem Jeffries, he's also very mealy-mouthed. And, it's just too bad that the Democrats can't put, better, more aggressive people into these positions. Then talking about both sides using memes to attack each other. The Democrats, of course, have been making lots of memes about Trump for the past, since he was inaugurated in January, making fun of him. The latest one I saw on Twitter was Trump dressed as Marie Antoinette with all this bouffant hair and all these bows all the way around. And it said, let them eat cake, instead of having affordable health care. And then Trump this week posted his own doctored picture of Hakeem Jeffries next to Senator Chuck Schumer speaking outside the Oval Office at the White House. And he sort of animated it and put a sombrero on Hakeem Jeffries' head and gave him a little mustache to make him look Mexican. And then he added a fake voiceover for Chuck Schumer saying, everybody hates Democrats. And, that's why we're trying to get more illegal immigrants to come into the U.S. so that they can vote for us, the Democrats, which is really a long-held Republican trope that they've pushed, saying that Democrats always want open borders so they can get more potential voters in the future. I think that has been slightly true, but I think the Republicans have totally exaggerated it. I do have to admit, though, that under Biden's administration, there didn't seem to be any control of U.S. Land crossings, especially the ones with Mexico. And all these illegal immigrants were flooding in from Mexico, from Venezuela, from Colombia. Many of them were criminals, rapists, and murderers. So in a way, I'm happy with Trump's clamp down on the border, but he's just gone too far with all these ICE raids across America. A horrible video appeared last week of an ICE agent throwing a supposed illegal Mexican immigrant woman onto the floor in front of her children and husband because she kept whining and like shouting at him. And it was just, emblematic of all these ICE officers who run around all of our streets in America with their faces covered like cowards, manhandling people, pushing them to the ground, humiliating them in public, handcuffing them unnecessarily. It just is a bad look. It makes us look like a cheap third world dictator-run country where people are disappeared into vans. And another good piece of news this week was a federal judge ruled that it was illegal for the Trump administration to target foreign students in the U.S. who espoused pro-Palestinian views. So this was a big win for these foreign students in the U.S. The judge did not say how he would put this judgment into action. He did not say what penalties the federal government would have to pay. He said there's going to come in a further ruling later this month, I think. So we're waiting to see. But, this was a main strategy of the Trump administration, I'm sure, suggested by Stephen Miller, who is a super extremist advisor to Donald Trump. A good friend of mine in Washington calls him, Stephen the Nazi, because he's so anti-immigrant. And he supposedly gets super happy when all these people get violently deported, clapping his hands. And he was so obviously happy about nasty things happening to immigrants in the U.S. that even Donald Trump had to admonish him once and saying, I don't think you should be clapping your hands and laughing about this. It's just not appropriate. Hello, and welcome back to my podcast. This is Rashid speaking to you from Houston, Texas. I have a little sneak preview for you guys. I've just finished writing my first book. It's a memoir of my life, growing up in Brazil, in Switzerland, and working in Saudi Arabia and the Philippines as a journalist for more than 20 years. I'll show you a sneak preview of the cover of the title. It's called Exile of the Heart, a memoir across 3 continents. So in it, I talk about working at Arab News in Saudi Arabia and how we had to censor so much of the news. We had to censor both the written news that we printed in the newspaper and photographs of women that were showing too much cleavage or too much legs, and how it was really crude in the beginning, but then when we got Photoshop, it became much better quality censorship, but it still looked very weird. I also talk about covering the Philippine elections in 1992, when Fidel Ramos was elected, the former general was elected president of the Philippines. And then I also write about my boyfriend in Brazil, who I was with for many years, who ended up robbing me and my mother's house, and how this affected me. And put me into a depression tailspin. So my book should be out by the end of this month, October or early November. It will be available on Amazon, on Barnes and Noble, and other platforms. So please look for it, and please buy a copy and leave a review on Amazon. Thank you. Ever since I grew up in Brazil, I lived in Brazil from the age of 11 to 18, from 1975 to 1982. Then I left Brazil for many, many, many years to go to school and go to college in the US. And then I worked in Saudi Arabia for 19 years. And then I worked for 1 year in Abu Dhabi, helping set up the English language newspaper, The National. And then I finally came back to Brazil at the end of 2008 and stayed for another 11 years living with my mother after my father had passed away. And both in my childhood and later as an adult, I watched many telenovelas because in Brazil, at least on Rede Globo, which is the largest TV network in Brazil, it's privately owned, they have at least 3 to 4 telenovelas every day. So like the first one starts at maybe 4:30 in the afternoon, and then there's like a 6 o'clock novella, and then there's a 7 o'clock novella, and then there's like a 9:30 novella. And as the time gets later, the themes become more serious and less suitable to a G or a PG audience. So the latest novella that I have become addicted to is called Vale Tudo, which means everything goes in Portuguese. And it's a remake of a 1989 telenovela of the same name, with all the same characters and the same storyline, basically. So in the original Vale Tudo, Beatriz Segal, was a very famous Brazilian actress, plays Odete Reutemann, who is a very rich woman, the head of a business empire in Rio, owner of an airline called TCA, which means Transcontinental Airlines, and her family, her daughter called Heleninha, who in the original version was played by Renata Sorá, another great Brazilian actress. And it's about all the machinations within the family of Odete manipulating everybody, and Odete getting away basically with murder most of the time because she's so rich she can just pay everybody off, and she gets away with it. So the basic story is that Heleninha, who is Odete Reutemann's daughter, is an alcoholic, and she is married to a man called Marco Aurelio, who in the new version is played by Alexandre Nero, another great Brazilian actor. And they have a son together. And then they do this through flashbacks. They show it's like 11 years before in these flashbacks. And it's Heleninha and her brother called Leandro are in Angra dos Reis, which is like sort of a resort beach city outside of Rio de Janeiro. And she's drunk and she goes to this house looking for her husband and her brother. And they're both there at this house having a little party with these women, and they're drinking. And Heleninha starts screaming, screaming at her brother, saying, how could you not be on my side? Why are you here with my husband? Blah, blah, blah. You abandoned me. You're my twin brother. And then she looks at her husband and says that who's cavorting with some woman he just picked up, off the street. And she starts screaming at him, and he screams back and says that he can't stand living with her anymore, and blah blah blah. And she says, "Oh well, you should leave." And he said, "Oh, I'll gladly leave you if that's what you want." And then she disappears with the brother, and she's totally drunk, and she tells her brother, "Oh, I'm going to drive back. I'm going to drive back to their beach house in Angra dos Reis." He says, "No, no, no, you're too drunk." On the way back, she is supposedly driving, but then later it turns out that she wasn't driving, that it was the mother, Odeci, who had showed up. There's an accident, a terrible accident. Odeci comes out fine, Elenia is fine, but there's this body sticking out of the car. They can only see the legs, and they think that it's Leandro, the brother. They think he's dead. So, flash forward to today, Elenia and everybody else in the family thinks that Leonardo died that night in the car crash, when in fact he didn't. He was actually thrown from the car and ended up in the garden of this poor woman's house. And she found him the next day, and she took care of him for these 11 years. Of course, she calls Odeci Hoichman and gets her to, send her money every month to take care of her son. And she calls Odeci Hoichman to come see her son. She says, I found him, he's alive, he's alive. And on yesterday's episode, they show a flashback of when Odeci went to this poor woman's house, and she sees her son in bed, and he looks, horribly injured, and he can't talk, and his eyes are closed. And Odeci refuses. She says, no, 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 I buried my son yesterday. This isn't my son. You have to take care of him for me. I can't deal with it. And it turns out that it was this poor woman's husband who had been beating her, who was drunk. He went out at the time that the car with Odeci and Elenia and Leandro was coming near their house right before they had the accident. And the car actually hits him and kills him. And so those were his legs that were sticking out from under the car. So he was buried as if he was Leandro. And they have this huge mausoleum in the cemetery allegedly for Leandro. And earlier in the novella, we saw this poor older woman always going to the cemetery and laying flowers on the tomb of supposed tomb of Leandro, and nobody knew why. They kept chasing her away. Like Elenia saw her there once, and she said, "Did you know my brother? Did you know my brother? Why are you leaving flowers at his tomb?" And the old woman would run off without saying anything. So in this new version, Odeci Hoichman is played by Deborah Bloch. She's been doing a beautiful, beautiful job. She's a very famous Brazilian actress. She's 61 years old now. She's from the Bloch family that originally, her ancestors immigrated from Ukraine to Brazil. They're a Jewish family. And some of her relatives they first founded a magazine called Manchete, which is like a Brazilian version of Parimatch. And then they started their own TV network called Rede Manchete, which lasted a few years but then went bankrupt. But she's really, really good in this new version. And in this new version, she has sort of like a male prostitute as her boyfriend, and then she eventually marries him in the novella. And his name is Cesar, and he's played by Cauã Raymond, who's also a very good Brazilian actor. In the old version of Vale Tudo, which came out in 1989, so 36 years ago, there are only 2 black actors in a cast of 49 roles. In the new version, there are 12 people of color. Several of the main characters are people of color. So in this new version, it's much more politically correct. It's much more representative of, Brazil, because more than, I think, 60% of Brazilians are of mixed race. So it's a really good a really good telenovela. And in the old version, there was a lesbian couple, and I think they were both white. But in the old version, because of societal norms at the time, they thought they couldn't have this lesbian couple be happy in the end, so they had one of the women in this lesbian relationship killed in the old telenovela. In the new telenovela, one of the lesbians is white and the other one is a person of color, and they're both happy and they both have a young daughter together. So you can see how societal norms have changed a lot in those 36 years. I watch it here on Globo's international channel, which I get through my cable provider, DirecTV. It's $30 a month, which is quite expensive, but it's excellent because I get to see their national news, evening news program, Journal Nacional, every day. It's shown here live. And this novella is also shown at the same time that it's shown in Brazil. So it's really, really good. Some people used to complain that novellas were taking up too much of their time because they would get addicted to several of them, and they would spend the whole evening, watching 3 or 4 novellas in a row, which is, not good because you don't read books, you don't read newspapers, you don't go out and do things with friends or family. So, but it is also easily to overcome this addiction if they have several telenovelas in a row that don't appeal to you, and then you just stop watching. So that's it. I hope you've enjoyed my podcast this week. Please tune in next week for a new episode. Like and subscribe to my podcast, please. And I'll see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.